Hi, I'm a weeb and I built an app to teach myself Japanese in quarantine. I've been a weeb for a long time, and like most longtime weebs, there came a point in my childhood when I was binge-watching fan-subbed episodes of Naruto, and I thought to myself,
boy, I wish I didn't have to wait for the subtitles to come out before I could watch the next episode.
So I set about learning Japanese, and like most weebs, I failed. I tried every book for self-study, but I couldn't get any further than memorizing the kana and some verb conjugations. Then I tried to find a teacher, but nobody in my hometown was willing to teach me. And that had me bummed for a while, but not for long, because soon enough, high school German class would teach me that classroom language learning is more often than not a big waste of time. It was clear books and classes would not get me fluent in Japanese. Anytime I came across someone who actually spoke a foreign language fluently, they seemed to agree. They would all repeat the same mantra. The key to fluency is immersion. This was confirmed not only by people who had moved to foreign countries and learned languages that way, but also by people like the infamous Katsumoto, who, by his own account, learned Japanese within a couple years without ever setting foot in Japan by making his life all Japanese all the time. So he would only watch Japanese TV, he would only listen to Japanese music, and he basically cut out all English influence from his life wherever possible. In this way, he created a sort of artificial immersion environment for himself. And he also advocated for things like kanji flashcards. Now, I couldn't afford to travel to Japan, so Katsumoto's advice sounded like godsend. I knew that I could replicate his success if I could just follow the same steps he did. But the problem was I just couldn't. Turning off the subtitles just sucked all the joy out of watching anime for me because I couldn't understand the plot, and I found his style of kanji flashcards just intolerably boring. I simply didn't have the discipline it takes, or so I thought at the time. I concluded that I would just have to wait to go to Japan before I could actually immerse myself in the language that way. So one day I would go to Japan and experience the language and culture firsthand, and all of my weebly dreams would come true. Now fast forward to 2020, for the first time in my life, I'm finally poised to take the big Japan trip of a lifetime, and the country closes its borders to international tourists. So here I am, stuck at home, nearly jobless, and like so many others, just unsure about the future. So I was passing my days watching videos of tourists luckier than me, playing all the coolest games at the Japanese arcades, and eating all the yummy snacks from the Japanese 7-Elevens, and I was just yearning for all of these experiences which were just out of my reach. So I made a resolution to myself. I decided not only am I going to drop everything and go to Japan as soon as they reopen their borders, I would also do everything in my power to learn as much Japanese as possible before then. That way, when the time came, that trip would be exponentially better than it would have been otherwise. Now, instead of postponing the big trip, I would be preparing for a bigger and better trip. So by the time I got to Japan, I'd be fluent in Japanese. So I made an app about it. It's totally free and open source, and there's a link in the description if you're interested. I'm sure if I had spent all this time studying Japanese instead of working on this app, I would be 20 times better at Japanese by now. But I actually don't regret it, because even though it was a roundabout way to learn Japanese, I think at this point it's safe to say it actually worked. So I've been using my app for about a year now, and for the first time in my life, I can actually enjoy anime without subtitles. So how did I go from a young failure of a weeb without the discipline or attention span to learn Japanese on his own to somebody who was so sure that he could pull it off that I could even make an app to help others do the same? I knew I could succeed at learning Japanese this time around because at this point in my life, I had already had the experience of learning a different foreign language to fluency, namely German. I had actually moved to Germany a couple years prior, and I had just passed the official B2 proficiency test, which earned me a permanent residency card here. Now, if you're not familiar, B2 is the fourth on a 6-level scale of language proficiency called the CEFR. B2 is fluency by any reasonable definition. At the time I took the test, I was already doing all my official adult business in German, like talking to the doctor, insurance company, and my landlord and everything. So after learning German to this level, I could compare that successful experience with my failed experience of learning Japanese, and by comparing the two attempts, I noticed there were some key differences. So these 3 principles of successful language learning would shape my new Japanese study plan, and eventually they would also shape the development of my app, Knowclip. So a few months into learning Japanese as a kid, I had gotten most of the way through some books labeled for beginners, so I figured I was maybe intermediate or at least an advanced beginner. But some books labeled intermediate were way too easy, and some books labeled for beginners are way too advanced, and I couldn't tell until actually buying a book and using it for a while. So with no concrete measure of my progress, I had no clue what materials to tackle next. Now for my German studies, I had a concrete goal. So by taking some practice tests and looking at some materials labeled by CEFR levels, it became clear that I was around A2 or B1. So now it was easy to find materials that were just right for me. A quick YouTube search would come up with loads of videos that were just challenging enough to ensure my progress, but not so challenging that I felt lost all the time. So I first went about learning Japanese with textbook exercises and vocabulary lists. While watching anime, sometimes I would know each word in a sentence, but the whole meaning of the sentence in its entirety was completely lost on me. I learned about Japanese, but I hadn't acquired the language. When I first moved to Berlin, despite years of high school German, my German wasn't really any better than my Japanese. Even when I knew enough to translate an English thought of mine into a coherent German sentence, I couldn't understand people's replies back to me. So real fluid conversation was impossible. So every time I walked out my door, I had a stark reminder that my listening comprehension sucked. I knew I needed to practice listening to real spoken German. Once I did that, I finally started to acquire the language. And believe it or not, this listening-based approach was actually enough to pass the reading, writing, listening, and speaking sections of the B2 test, with just some shadowing thrown in and some minimal real-life German practice. Now, before you go saying, oh, so the truth comes out, you must have had it so easy because you were living in Berlin. Listen, if you're from Berlin, you know that was not the case. My experience living in Germany has actually taught me firsthand that moving to a new country and immersion in a new language are two totally separate things. I personally know lots of people from all sorts of countries who have been here as long as I have or longer, yet they speak little to no German. It's kind of a shame, but it's not really all their fault, because even if you studied German in high school like I had, most people you'll come across in Berlin are going to speak English way better than you can speak German. So in the end, it's just easier for everybody to speak English, which is weird because this is Germany, but that's how it is. Immersion isn't about changing your environment. It's about active engagement with a language, which was bad news for my German because I had to actually work for it, but it was great news for my Japanese because that means I didn't have to move to Japan to learn Japanese. Of course, this is pretty much the core message of Katsumoto. As a kid, I thought all Japanese all the time was some kind of step-by-step process, like a self-contained system. But now I think what he was really advocating for was just consistent engagement with real spoken Japanese. And this leads into the final principle of language learning success. If I could go back in time, I would tell my little weeb self, just because you don't have what it takes to do exactly what Katsumoto did, that doesn't mean you don't have what it takes to learn Japanese. That just means you don't get joy out of the same things that he does. I hadn't considered that perhaps he actually enjoyed the process of repping kanji flashcards and watching shows that he only barely understood at first. Instead of trying to copy that process exactly, I should have tried to copy that consistency which he brought to his engagement with Japanese. And the only way I could have realistically done that is by infusing some joy into my study process. It may sound corny, but this really is the most important point. When I learned German, I had fun doing it. I decided to use only those materials which sparked some joy for me. I knew when a video or audio recording was working when, like, a few times per minute, I would miss something, and then the pure desire to know what's happening in the story would fuel my motivation to look a word up or rewind and re-listen. I wasn't just doing it for the sake of increasing my vocabulary. Since I loved the stories, I was doing it out of a sense of curiosity. I wasn't dogmatic about it like Katsumoto. I was totally open to using materials aimed at learners. Starting out, I got lots of mileage out of articles from DW Deutsch Lernen and YouTube videos from Easy German, but I also supplemented them with lots of native videos from the YouTube channel Galileo, which is also a TV show. After a few months, when I got bored of those sources, I let the joy principle be my guide, and after some searching, I found some German documentaries and journalism from Arte and Funk, which made German practice fun again. Soon I got confident enough to try audiobooks, but I found that the authors I was interested in, like big names, Goethe, Kafka, Hesse, they all used language that was too complicated for me to understand on my own. But I found I could get away with using these more advanced audiobooks when I listened with an English translation at hand. I ignored people's advice that translations are always a hindrance to language learning because I could tell that they were helping me get joy out of these native materials, and they really did wonders for increasing my vocabulary and listening comprehension. Now I had 3 clear principles of language learning success, and I set about putting together my perfect study plan for Japanese. As far as I know, the CEFR levels aren't used much in Japan, but there is a common measure of Japanese skill, the JLPT levels. I didn't take the JLPT, and I have no plans to, but when I did some research about the 5 JLPT levels, I was able to get a relatively concrete measure of my Japanese skills. So I established that I was around N4 by just taking some practice tests and looking through materials aimed at N4 learners. Then it became clear what I should tackle next, especially in terms of grammar, so that I could feel that I was progressing from day to day. That didn't mean I was only using materials aimed at JLPT test takers. There's lots of good stuff out there that makes no mention of JLPT levels. So say if you come across a textbook that says something like beginner, intermediate, advanced or something, chances are you can still find out what JLPT level that's appropriate for by doing an internet search or maybe posting on a forum. So the same goes for actual native level materials like TV shows or anime. So this time I would focus on listening to real spoken Japanese. Besides helping me with my listening comprehension, this would actually also help me a lot with fixing some bad pronunciation habits, especially pitch accent, which is a hot topic in Japanese language learning circles these days. So this meant when evaluating a textbook, I would ignore absolutely everything except passages with recordings. So I would engage only with the audio and the corresponding text. As far as I was concerned, all vocabulary lists, exercises, and absolutely everything else that wasn't full sentences in Japanese with audio available was useless filler. So I would look at grammatical explanations from time to time, but I knew from my experience with German that I would only be able to internalize these grammatical structures by listening to them used in real sentences over and over again. So that's what I set out to do. I knew I would be able to get some joy out of my favorite anime, but native materials were still just a bit too challenging for me at N4 level. So again, I wasn't dogmatic about it. Materials for Japanese learners were on the table too, as long as they were right for my level and they had good audio recordings. So just because Katsumoto didn't mean I had to do the same. I just let the joy factor be my guide. So that didn't mean that every textbook had to be just a 100% enjoyable experience. There's no textbook like that. That just meant that I only used the parts that I enjoyed. So in one book, An Introduction to Intermediate Japanese, I skipped out on half the passages because they didn't have recordings, but on top of that, I also threw out half of those because they just didn't spark any joy. I focused on the dialogues and the reading sections, which told full, coherent stories because that's what I liked. In another textbook, Tobira, I skipped all the dialogues altogether. I found them to be contrived and uninteresting, and the voice acting didn't bring much to the table either. On the other hand, the reading sections were all really fascinating, and for these kinds of passages, that amateur voice acting just suited the material just fine. So by following these 3 principles, I settled on a few books. The Graded Reader series from Tadok, Introduction to Intermediate Japanese, Tobira, Shadowing Let's Speak Japanese. Since I knew that these materials would get me close to N3 level, and that's when native materials would start becoming a little more interesting for me, I decided to save my favorite anime for after I was done with these things. A sort of milestone in my Japanese studies to look forward to. I would supplement my studies with YouTube videos, but after doing all my research and thinking about my language learning experiences in the past, I decided that the backbone of my study would be listening to these stories and dialogues over and over again until I understood them effortlessly. So I had finally settled on a plan to learn Japanese. I had a concrete goal in mind and a set of materials that were right for my level. Then I started to face some challenges. These were the same challenges I faced while learning German, but they were more pronounced. Japanese is just so much harder than German for a native English speaker. All the grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, it's all just so different. Since I'm a software developer by trade, I naturally started to envision a way to solve these problems through software. So I came up with a small wish list of features that would make my input-based learning method a bit easier. Easy rewind. While listening to these audio recordings, especially for the first time, I would often rewind a few seconds to hear some words that I didn't catch, and this process got tedious real fast. So I just wanted to navigate right to the start of the previous line instead of finicking with rewind controls all the time. Instant dictionary lookup. So when I was using resources with English translations, I found I didn't have to look up words in a dictionary that often, but even those few times, switching between the audio, the text, and the dictionary just really interrupted my flow. Targeted review. So I was still not in Japan. So even though I was engaged in these listening sessions, there wasn't any part of my life outside of them that involved Japanese. If I wanted to review and reinforce what I've been learning, even if there was only one part of the recording that I was having trouble with, the only practical option was to re-listen to these tracks from start to finish. I had to deal with recordings in their entirety instead of targeting those parts that I wanted to review. And this review issue has long been solved by spaced repetition software like Anki, so my software would just need to generate an Anki flashcard deck using those audio clips. I could have just sucked it up and dealt with it, I'm sure of it, but I couldn't stop thinking this could be so much easier. So I got coding. My goal with Knowclip was to make something that works on Windows, Mac, and Linux that you can just download and use right away without reading any tutorials or watching any how-to videos. So I worked really hard on the whole user experience, and now, having used it myself for some time, I'm pretty happy with the result, though it's still in beta. So did I succeed? Well, I've been using Knowclip for about a year now, and I finally reached my first milestone. So I've graduated from textbook dialogues to actual anime. It feels like a whole new world has opened up. I've really gotten into YouTube channels like Yuru Gengo Gaku Radio and Takamatsu Nana, which I would have never been able to understand when I first resumed studying Japanese in 2020. And truth be told, I haven't been that consistent. You can see my Anki streak here. So there are clearly lots of gaps where I didn't do any Japanese at all. So yeah, I probably would have made even more progress if I had more discipline, but even as an imperfect human, this system seems to be working. As for my goal to learn fluent Japanese before my big trip, well, Japan is still closed to international tourists, so I guess I still have time. But honestly, even if, God forbid, Japan never opens up its borders again, I think it will still have been worth it. My world has already expanded by just a little bit since I'm able to enjoy Japanese content that's never been translated to English before. And since I've just been following the joy principle during my studies, I've been having a blast learning all this time. So even if I wouldn't call myself fluent yet, it already feels like a success, and that's enough for me. And apparently other people have been getting use out of Knowclip as well, even at these early stages. I've already got some supporters on Patreon who I am incredibly grateful to. Like seriously, it's because of people like you that open source free software exists, so just thank you so much. So the inevitable question, where can you find content to use with Knowclip? There's some good news and some bad news. First, the bad news. Right now, as of November 2021, you'll have to find your own video content to use with Knowclip. I can't redistribute anything that I was using to learn Japanese with, but I'm sure that with enough searching, you can also find some nice video and audio content to download onto your computer. Knowclip works with all of the most common video formats, so if you've got any MP4 or MKV file, it'll probably work. It would be nice if you could just download MP4 files from YouTube, but YouTube doesn't make it easy because then everybody would just download the video straight to their computer and they wouldn't make any ad money. So maybe there's a nice legal way you can download YouTube videos and subtitles onto your computer. I don't know, you'll have to look into that yourself, sorry. If you know some nice legal ways to do that, then please share it in the comments, that would be amazing. The good news is I already have a bunch of ideas to make it easier to get content to use with Knowclip. I can't give a time frame or share details yet, but if you subscribe to this channel or follow me on Twitter, then I'll be posting about it as soon as I can. The other good news is that Knowclip itself is free to download it and use, and it's going to be free forever. Just go to knowclip.com, K-N-O-W, clip.com, click the download button, follow the instructions, very important, and you can start using it right away. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good one.